Do they come from Satan? Do they come from God? They come from both. And third, we're going to look at the purpose of these weaknesses. Is there a goal for these weaknesses? And so let's look at the first question. What is the weaknesses here? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 to 10, it says, right? But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. What are the weaknesses Paul has in mind here? Right? He says he delights in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. Insults, right? When people think of clever ways of making your faith or your lifestyle or your words or you look stupid or look weird or inconsistent, you're being insulted. Paul delights in this insults. In hardships, what are hardships? Circumstances that come upon you, that's forced upon you, right? This can mean, refer to situations where you feel trapped. You didn't plan it this way. You didn't plan it or think that it would be this way. But there you are. And it's hard. It's hard. In persecutions, right? Wounds and abuse or pain, circumstances, acts of prejudice and exploitation from people because of your faith, because of your Christian moral commitments. It's when you are treated not fairly, right? You're being persecuted. These weaknesses are difficulties, Paul says, right? Calamities, right? Distress, troubles. This idea is one of pressure or crushing or being weighed down, being crushed by the circumstances around you that tend to overcome you with stress and tensions. So you can see that Paul has in mind here, circumstances and things, weaknesses, right? And this weakness, Paul is not referring to sinful behavior. He's not talking about here, as weaknesses, like we might sometimes say, he has a weakness for lust, or she has a weakness for overeating. Paul's not talking about bad choices we make. He's not saying the power of Christ is perfected in our bad choices, or I will boast all the more gladly about my bad choices. But weaknesses that Paul is referring to in this text are circumstances, situations, experiences, and wounds that make us look weak. Things we would probably get rid of if we had, the human strength to get rid of. If we had the health, we would not like it. Okay. So the answer to our first question is the weaknesses are not sins, but experiences and situations and circumstances and wounds that are hard to bear and that we can't remove, either because they are beyond our control, because they're beyond our control. Second, where do these weaknesses, where do these things, these trials, these hardships, these trouble come from? What is the source of such weakness? Do they come from Satan or do they come from God? Let's look at Paul's experience here, his example of himself. Paul says, in verse 1 and 4, Paul describes an amazing revelation of God's glory that he had been given. He was caught up into paradise and heard things that could not be told on earth. God gave him a vision of heaven. Right? We hear these stories of people who dreamed that they went to heaven and all these things. But here Paul was actually given a vision, a revelation of what heaven was like. Right? And so he says, right? And I know and I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things that man is not permitted to tell. How easily it would have been for Paul to think that he was already rising above the ordinary hardships and troubles of earthly life, because he was given such a privilege. But in verse 7, it shows us what actually happened. In verse 7, it tells us, to keep me from being conceited, because of these surpassing great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Now this thorn in the flesh, whether it was the physical problems, like health problems that Paul had, or relentless enemies attacking him. Right? This thorn in the flesh is one of the weaknesses that Paul was talking about, before. We know that this thorn in the flesh was this weakness because, Paul prayed to God that it would be taken away from him, this thorn in the flesh, in verse 8. 3 times he pleaded with the Lord. And the Lord answered him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weaknesses. And so this thorn was a weakness that Paul carried, that he had. And so where did this thorn in the flesh come from? Paul called it a messenger of Satan in verse 7. Given to him to harass him, to torment him. So one clear answer to this question is where it comes from is that weaknesses come from Satan. Satan afflicts the children of God through his angels or messengers. And his aim, his desire is destruction and death and misery to God's people. But it's not just this simple. Satan is not the only one at work here. God is also at work. This thorn is not just the work of Satan to destroy, but it's also a work of God to save. We know this for 2 reasons. Because first, Paul describes the purpose for this thorn, in terms of preventing him from pride. Right? Satan desires, his goal is to produce pride in us, right? Not to prevent pride. That's how he kills, either with pride in what we have done or despair over what we haven't done. Paul's revelation in paradise made him vulnerable to pride and self-exaltation. So God used the hostile intentions of Satan for Paul's holiness, to sanctify him, to make him more righteous. Satan wanted to make Paul miserable and turn him away from the faith and the ministry and the value of the vision that he had been given. But God wanted to make Paul humble and to turn him away from self-exaltation. So God appointed the thorn of Satan for the work of salvation. The other reason we know that the thorn is God's work is not just Satan, and not just Satan, is when Paul prays in verse 8 that God would take away this thorn. And the Lord says to him, no, because my power is made perfect in this weakness. In other words, I have a purpose in what is happening to you. This is not ultimately Satan's destroying work. It is ultimately mine, God's saving, sanctifying work. This hardship that Paul had to endure. just like with Job, God allowed or permitted Satan to afflict his righteous servant Job. And God turned these afflictions for his good purposes.